recording is going on. Okay. If you saw the email that I sent out about notes, there is. I'm going to post-process the group chat, and so the idea is that. Spelled that wrong, but that's okay. I'll fix that later. That there are certain commands that you can put into the group chat, prefixed with the @ topic, item, item being the important one, action being another one. So as we talk through today's meeting, if anybody wants to add an item to the notes, just do @item and then a string, and that'll be automatically put into the notes or into the chat. The chat is saved, and I will post-process that chat for meeting notes. Wanted to try that this week and see how that works. Essentially, I take that stuff, post-process it to Markdown, and then we have meeting notes. As part of that, if people could do @here, then that will register their attendance in this meeting, and we'll have a list of attendees. If you do @here, then a separate name, then that's the name you'll be registered under versus the name you have in chat. So feel free to continue that on, and we'll see how this works. See if this works at all for meeting notes. Again, anybody, just do an @item, and that would be a great, right? Anytime you want to do it. The thing I said earlier before was that there was a time conflict for this meeting with a SIBA Tiger Team meeting. I just heard about that this morning. I'm still trying to figure out what that means.
David, this is Saurav.
Yep.
Yeah, that meeting has far fewer people, and I recommended to Bill Snow to reschedule that meeting next week onwards. So I don't think you have to worry about it.
Okay.
Unless Bill says otherwise at some point, but I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. Good. Great. That actually solves a lot of problems. All right. Going on from there, then let's move to the topics at hand. Agenda bashing. And anybody have anything they want to add, modifying the agenda? Not. Okay, given there's no agenda bashing, we're going to go to goals and scope. There have been email threads this week that recommend that we need to better understand the goals and scope of this brigade. I generally agree with that. There were some specific questions came up, whether this brigade encompasses stabilization of SIBA, Volta, kind of the whole solution, or just Volta. I would like to state that it is Volta only. I don't think we want to, well, I don't want to expand it out to anything beyond that because I think that just becomes too big. Any thoughts on that, or any real objections to that?
I think it makes sense, but when you say Volta only, do you mean also the honors application that are used by Volta, or it's really only Volta?
Good question. Not sure how to answer that because, again, I think it's going to have to.
I think it's pretty easy to answer that, right? I mean, Volta is not standalone software. Volta and ONOS go together with the apps. That's what makes it complete. So the apps are in general stable. ONOS is stable. It's Volta that we need to get to the same level of stability.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that.
Is there
particularly
anything that, sorry,
doing
is there
IGMP.
anything, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Is there anything that we are going to be missing in testing if we don't have SIBA?
Is there anything we're going to be missing in testing with respect to Volta capability?
Yes, and SIBA. Like, is there something that SIBA will enable us, enable certain features in Volta that without SIBA we can't test?
So okay, I can think of something like when SIBA implements the AT&T workflow, what happens is after EAPOL authentication, the NEM layer in SIBA makes the Volt add subscriber call, right?
Right.
Without the NEM layer, with just Volta and ONOS, somebody has to manually put in that, make that Volt add subscriber call right now. But, if there are these cases like these that we need to handle, we can handle that on a Volta level, just making sure that if you're just using Volta and ONOS, the functionality, the test cases are covered. But it doesn't mean that we need to have NEM over there. It doesn't mean that we have to have the AG switch over there. And it doesn't mean that we need to use SIBA's Helm charts for installation. Doesn't mean any of that, right? It's just that the functionality needed from Volta and ONOS should just be covered. And those are covered, right? I mean, it's just things like add subscribers, remove subscribers, reboot the OLT, reboot an ONU. Those things, those things are all Volta functionality that we just need to ensure that get triggered and get the expected responses out of them.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. There was also a document or some email threads about ways to go forward in development. With one side of the spectrum, I'll call it saying, get Volta feature complete. We'll leave out what defines feature complete for the moment, and then stabilize it. And the other kind of end of the spectrum is, look, let's stabilize kind of where we are now and get together a process that provides a mechanism to add features and maintain stability over time. Those were the other two kind of point that I kind of pulled out of some of the email threads going back and forth. I'm honestly not quite sure how to resolve those. I do think we need to understand the feature set that we expect Volta to quote unquote release with. And we need to know what we have to get implemented before we have to stabilize. So whether that is the complete feature set or a partial feature set, I think we need to decide that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is Saurav again. From the email thread, it seemed to me that Matt proposed one of those options, right? To develop a stable version or two, and the process to guarantee stability going forward, right? He defined it as the exit criteria, and most people agreed that the Brigade should not last forever and needs such an exit criteria. So the proposal came from that. Bill, Snow, and David agreed David, you, Bainbridge.
Yep.
I think you agreed. So did Ken and Mahir. I agree with it as well. So that was my conclusion from the email thread.
Hi, it's Kirill here. I've read through the thread as well. It's all meaningful proposals, of course, as long as we think through how we manage to align that with initiatives, right? Because the final user of the product of this brigade would be the operators. So as long as we manage to match expectations from those initiatives, that all should be fine.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we need to think hard about, while this work in the stabilization is going on, there should still be a place where new features can still be developed, right? It unfortunately needs, we cannot stop one for the other. And we need to come up with a way where new features can still go in, presumably on top of something that may not be stable, while the stability work happens in a different place where the new features aren't coming in. But I don't think I found anyone else on the brigade, or at least on the mailing list, saying that we should stop one for the other. Any thoughts? Anyone else? Matt? You want to go?
Well, my only concern is that as new features are introduced, if they're changing our code, I don't want to say code that we can't stabilize things that are changing, is really what it comes down to. And so if they are really kind of features that aren't changing the core code, we can stabilize the core. But if those features require changes to the core, then it becomes infinitely harder to stabilize the core. So take tech profiles, for example. I think that winds itself through everything. But it is a feature. How we would stabilize something while that feature is being introduced. That makes sense?
Yeah, agreed. I think Matt had suggested leaving tech profiles out to start with on the very first stable version. Not the long-term release version, not the feature complete long-term release version, just a stable base to start things off with.
So is there a list of what work is considered for stabilization? I mean, just to clarify exactly what the work is for this group. I mean, just if we're thinking about I thought originally the idea was to have a stabilization of 2.0 with tech profiles as part of that. So now we're talking about stabilization initially without tech profiles. So what is that, I guess?
Yeah, originally it did include tech profiles because tech profiles were meant to be merged this week, I thought.
Yeah, I think it's coming in today or tomorrow.
So does that change kind of Matt's proposal about leaving tech profiles in versus out? If they are going to be merged this week or today or tomorrow, to take them out and stabilize without them is now more effort in some sense.
I'll leave it to Ahmed to answer if it's really coming in this week. We haven't branched yet, so.
Yeah, this Girish.
Hi.
Yeah, please go ahead, Amit.
Go ahead, Girish. It's fine.
Yeah, so as we speak, there are Radisys has raised reviews, so it's out for review right now. So I would uh, I would really wait for a week before we branch out for stabilization. I would really want the speed profile and tech profile enhancements to be part of the stabilization brigade.
Would it be something to consider the scope of work necessary on this early release? First, list down all the items and all the work elements that we believe are needed. Because then the rest would be as introduction of new features would come in, then it would be just the testing of each additional feature that would come in. It doesn't answer the question of how we would do merging or what would be our branching strategy, but at least it gives us a work breakdown and some kind of idea of everything, all the works we need to do.
So in previous meetings, we had talked about an MVP. Let me pull off.
I think you scared people when you said MVP. I think it was just, our base stabilization features.
Right. So that was this
product. and I that really should be referring to the long-term stable release of Volta. So this is not that. This is really just getting the stable base ready with the minimum feature set, which is what you're highlighting.
Yep. So, okay. So this was the minimal feature set for stabilization.
I just have a quick question about while we're on this page there. When we're talking about the HA Volta core and we're talking about at least restart on failures.
Mm-hmm.
When we just set out to do HA, the failures that we're talking about, like for example, one server goes down or one or couple of instances go down, but not an entire service goes away. For example, when we are talking about Kafka, we're not talking about the entire Kafka service goes away. So if now we're saying that we need to, any service that needs to go away completely, and we need to recuperate from that, then there's feature work to be done in the core for that. For example, for Kafka, currently we have on startup, there's a number of topics that get created. There's a lot of other things that get done with Kafka. So if the entire Kafka service goes away, then we need to redo all those things. So there would be like almost like feature work to be done without like a name of feature, but almost like an HA kind of feature to be done. So like even this line item there, we need to clarify what we meant by at least restarts and failures.
Okay. So let me think of that one. Let me catch up on notes here a minute. So item MVP from previous meetings, really minimal viable features for stability. Actually, really features for stability release. In terms of things like service goes away or HA, I guess specifically for the example you used, I was thinking if Kafka goes away and then comes back, the topics would exist. And if Kafka goes away and comes back with the existing topics, things should reconcile. If Kafka needs new topics created, it goes away. I was not considering that use case, and I'd kind of be okay with that use case not being included in terms of that line item.
Oh, okay.
But to your other point, yes, it does need more clarification.
So, David, are we going to worry about things such as, if a message is pushed to Kafka and Kafka goes away after the message has been pushed, but before it's been sent to whoever cares about it, and then Kafka comes back and that message was lost? Does something like that fit into this discussion? I guess I'm just thinking Kafka goes away. There's all kinds of corner cases that come in from various bad things that could happen.
Yeah, I think that's going to be we need to clarify in more detail what we mean by certain of these line items. So, if a message is sent, never received, Kafka goes down, Kafka comes back up, and the message is lost forever, there's not much we can do about it. And if there's a required message, then I think you're going to start looking at guaranteed messaging with respect to Kafka. Put it in a database.
Yeah, or you need some kind of audit function now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I typically when I've looked at these problems using Kafka, if the message must be delivered, there's guaranteed messaging in Kafka. It just, again, puts the message in a database, has acts around the send. Could it still be lost? Yes. So does there still need to be an audit? Maybe. But again, I think that's under the umbrella of more detail around that. So we're still back to this list from previous weeks, I think, in terms of what are we going to finish feature-wise before we believe we can stabilize that first version. Trying to think, I don't see the, I guess the tech profiles are kind of embedded in this. So I think we're back to
Yes, it
that.
is.
So, pardon?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So are we back to this list of things? We'll call it minimal. We'll call it the feature list pre-stabilization, if you will. Are we generally agreed to that? And then along with the process, we will figure out, stabilize that and figure out a process to introduce new features?
Well, it will be good to understand the process. If there is a process to introduce new features and there is a viable and reasonable, feasible way to do that, then I think we could probably agree to stabilize some kind of reduced feature set. But if there isn't an answer or if there's no clarity whether there will be an answer or whether there will be a way to effectively introduce new features to the stable branch, then I think the other question should remain open.
Okay.
Like there has to be a way to introduce new features, right? Like otherwise the stable branch has no real use. There might be short periods of time where it's locked, like if we're trying to cut a release, but that's only for a week or two at a time. So I'm basically saying there has to be a way to add new features to the stable branch. I think we're stuck with that either way, so I think we're safe there.
So I'm going to take an action item. If today is the 23rd, we're looking at the 30th. I'll put the due date of the 30th. And that will be to clarify minimal set of features for stabilization. I'll work on that. And the rest of that process that was mentioned, I think, is the next items on the agenda. So is there any objection to move away from this then to the next item, the next agenda items?
Just one quick note. We talk a lot about the features, but we don't talk a lot about the actual system and the test, in the sense of like, are we talking about the cluster with 3 nodes? Are we talking about how many ONUs, OLTs are we using? Are we talking about using only BBSIM? Are we talking about real devices? I don't see that anywhere. Maybe I'm missing it. Maybe it's somewhere I didn't see it.
So Ken, I think some things are there and some things you pointed out are missing, and we do need, and so this action item that David just took to clarify all of these things should cover all of that. As long as we also understand Kirill's concern, and there still has to be a place where new features go in, and a process by which these features down the road get into the stable branch.
Okay, cool. I just saw David notes.
Ken, was there a question more about sort of the test scenario process and coming up with the how is Volta going to be tested, as opposed to what is going to be tested as a part of Volta? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I think those are separable questions, and we should at least come up with. And I think this also encompasses like the earlier Kafka discussion. There's a whole lot of things we could test, but sort of deciding what's important in the near term and making sure we get those covered, rather than saying we're going to test everything and not really being able to focus on anything and get a set plan out.
Yeah, I think kind of the testing philosophy is going to be important for this. I also think as part of the development process, some of those sanity tests, if you will, are going to start having to include, have you submitted test code along with your code, right? The pre-commit things. And so it's going to both be around how we're testing and what we're testing, as well as the volume of things we're testing.
That's a good question, by the way, or a good point, which I think also was in Volta Discuss, was brought up, is that we should be releasing an automated test suite together with each release of Volta, so that whoever consumes the code does not have to rebuild that test suite and therefore avoid duplication of work. I think it was that point someone was making on Volta Discuss, right?
Yeah, Bill was making that point, especially that across the carriers, if it would be more efficient if all of the carriers sort of threw in and made one shared test suite rather than try and reinventing the wheel in every location.
Exactly. And I think that's a very sensible thing for us to consider.
Agreed. All right. Closing that item, let's move to the branching and release strategy. And for that, Zach produced a document. I don't know if you want to share that, Zach, or you just want me to scroll through it for you. Your call.
Yeah, you can go through it, David. So just to share some initial thoughts about this. So David asked me to make up to talk about a branching and release strategy. The strategy I described in this document is very similar to what is currently being used in SIBA, and we found to be fairly to work pretty well. And basically, it focuses on having individual components, versioning those components, and then having an aggregation where they all get brought together in Helm charts and deployed. And then there's tests that happen either on an individual repo basis, which are usually unit tests, and then we test the aggregation and the Helm charts all together. I tried to make the document as you may think it looks pretty vague. I tried to make it suitable not just for stabilization, but for ongoing development work. When I'm talking about branching and using patch sets and other things, I think this would suit just as well a stable Volta that is seeing ongoing releases as something we're trying to stabilize. So one of the things it doesn't handle is lifecycle issues. This got brought up a couple times in the comments. Things like how many releases do we support for how long? I think those are probably issues outside of the actual mechanics of a branching and release strategy.
So to move on, I am not a big favor of creating full branches that development work goes into. The system we're using right now is Garrett, and it has the ability to keep patch sets alive for a long period of time, to do a lot of work in patch sets, to be able to move code between patch sets, either manually or between, or to change which branch they're applying to. I don't think it's a good idea to do feature development, mainly because trying to reunify branches is difficult. And then there's also the question of, if you decide to bring them over patch set by patch set, that you got all of the patch sets from one branch to another. It's just pretty messy. So because we have Garrett, I think it probably makes sense to try to keep maybe one feature or one portion or sub portion of a feature per patch set, and then apply those patch sets to a branch once they've either been tested or have we have some guarantee that they're not going to affect the stability of the overall code base. Are there any thoughts about that?
I think plenty of people agreed on the mailing list that feature branches is not something we want to do.
I think the important thing from my perspective is a patch set essentially is a branch. It's just a squished branch. Everything's in one commit as opposed to multiple commits. So when I create a patch set, I really am creating a branch. It's just the granularity of commits into it, in some sense.
Right. That's if people are used to, like, there are some other methodologies like git flow. If you think of just your own patch set as being a personal branch that you can apply that gets unified, that's one good way to think about it. Okay, moving on. There's a section about how to apply fixes. So if we find an error or some other regression and we need to apply that, generally, my thoughts are that we just need a way that guarantees that when you have a fix, that it gets applied to all the branches that it needs to be. So we decide what we're going to support. We just say there's this bug. We come up with a bunch of a fix for it. And then the decision comes down to, how do we apply that? Which order do we apply that to? My thoughts generally are that because you have more tests going through time, it's better to create it on the newest version and then move it backwards. That doesn't necessarily have to be the direction. It can, as long as you get it onto all branches, that's fine. It's just we're assuming that testing is better, that the test suite has improved, that unit tests are better on the newer version. So it's more likely that if you develop it on a newer version, that the test suite would catch any obvious errors in the patch. So if we move on, then there's I have a section that's how to version and branch in a disaggregated software product, and I give an example, sort of the generic example, and then how we're doing that in the other cord projects. So it comes into three things. You version each component individually. You use a semver-based method. You give things, you increase the minor version when a new feature arrives. And then we have mechanisms that allow that to become a tag in Git. The second point is only to create Git branches, and these are branches that are user-facing. These are things that would be like a stability branch or just a version branch on a release. You create those from existing tags. So for example, if you have a 1.0, something gets tagged 1.0, and then you might branch off of that and may release a 1.0.1. And then we have we have some sort of an aggregation point. And that's, at least in all the other cord projects, that's the Helm charts repo. And that's where we aggregate and we test the whole project. And then we have a platform version that we apply to those Helm charts. Now that doesn't necessarily, there's some discussion of whether that's some semantic versioning, or if that's some sort of marketing version. If you look at like a Linux distribution, it might be date based. You might have like, this is the first half of 2019, second half of 2019 release, or what have you. You can use normal versions, but just not do them in a Semver fashion. You can try to do Semver, but then you sort of lose out on it's more difficult, because if you have any external API changes, you have to, in the entire aggregation, you might have to increase that. That might not be desirable from a sort of a human communication or marketing perspective. And then I went on and discussed how the specific mechanisms that are being used. And then at the end of the document, I gave a bunch of example process, which I genericized from the existing Volta repos down to library core adapter and some charts, and went through some scenarios and what would happen and what tags would get applied during a development cycle. So I think quite a few people have commented on this, or at least looked at this. Are there any questions about this? Does this look like something that we want to go with going forward, or with modification?
Yeah, I have what might be a very basic question. Are we applying fixes, just using some branches, for example? Are we applying fixes to the stabilization branch 2.1 first, and then applying them to master, or are we applying to master first and then to 2.1?
I would opine that it's probably better to develop your fix on master and then move it back, but that may not be practically possible. You might be a fix to some component that's changed, in which case you would start wherever makes the most sense.
I guess my concern is that master, it diverges so greatly from new features that it's not practical to try to stabilize in master and do that development.
Right. There's a lot of not hard and fast, but when the option is available, going from newest or most recently developed to oldest is probably a better strategy than trying to develop on an old version and then port towards a newer.
But is the ultimate goal to get the fix into both of them? If we can't develop on the newer and then push to the older, do we develop on the older and then somehow get it pushed to the newer?
Yeah, well, of course, the goal is to get it to all of the branches that might have that error. As long as that happens, everything that's the ideal. It doesn't really matter what the mechanics are. It's just I express a preference to do it one way.
So from an owner's perspective, when people are patching it, it's patched onto master and then cherry picked onto every quote unquote supported version. And that's kind of what you're recommending. Is that right, Zach?
Well,
That's
actually,
correct.
that's not how it happens in ONOS, though.
That's how I've seen it happen in Onos.
Yeah, it also happens the other way. So, for example, we still patch 112 because that's our long-term stable version. And then we go ahead and put it in 113, 14, 15, 2.x.
So it's happening anyway the developer of the patch set wants it to happen.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, so I think Scott's comment came up with the assumption that we're going to keep master open for new features. Like we need a place for new features to go in. And then the stable branch is the stable branch. But yes, master will, if that is the assumption and everyone is fine with that, then definitely there's the possibility that master will, go beyond the stable branch or branches.
Yeah,
I get. So any fix has to be in the stable branch first because that's what we're fixing, and then find a way to get it into master.
I guess my concern is how is that different than what we're doing today, right? You cut a release branch 2.1, master continues on, and we patch both 2.1 and master. So I haven't seen any change from what we do today in behavior in some sense. And how do we expect, without a
Because
behavioral change, the branch
right.
stable? Or is the behavioral change that today not only are bug fixes going from master to the quote unquote release branches, but features are and everything else? And the changes, we're not going to do that latter part.
Well, I don't know. Do we go back and fix Volta releases?
Well,
Is
if
that
we presumably if a feature is added to master, we're not going to be adding that feature to right away to the release 2.1 branch, the stable branch.
right?
So I'm wondering if the only behavioral change we're seeing with respect to this is we're going to be more stringent about what we port from master to the release branch.
So another way to do the behavioral change is to treat patch sets, sort of flesh out patch sets before merging them into master more. And by that I mean, if it's not a complete feature, like if it's only half a feature, wait till you have the complete feature in that patch set. And sort of complete and ready to be stabilized feature. And rather than having the mentality that if a patch set isn't merged, it hasn't been accepted, it's not part of the core. Instead, if we keep the mentality that patch sets are branches in some sense, right? Then we can keep anything incomplete out of master. We could just use master as the stable branch, but this comes down to the other way of doing it, which is just you're putting a lot of workload. It just has to be harder to merge things into master, right? Like there has to be some final say on a patch set that's like, okay, this, whatever this is working on is actually complete and ready. And
well, then you're describing a feature branch.
But
in some way, as David mentioned earlier, your patch sets are feature branches.
Right, like it's the same. The only difference between a feature branch and a patch set is that a patch set has the mentality associated with it that the entire feature gets squashed into one patch, and then that gets merged.
Although I'd argue that today's development process, a patch set is not thought of as an entire feature, right? It's thought I can incrementally implement a feature over multiple patch sets today.
Right, and so if we're not doing branches, that's sort of the behavior change to enforce, or to make note of the community and just like, all right, we're not going to accept partial changes in patch sets. We're only going to take completed work, completed features, complete fixes. Like if we can't do branches, right, like full branches, I don't see another way to do it.
So I guess the question is, are we going to treat a patch set, that's the wrong way to say it, when a new feature is being introduced, do we expect its complete implementation to be done in one patch set?
What if the feature spans repositories? This is something that always bit us in SIBA. We would make a change to the core, and then that would also influence a change in the service. And now you've got the feature implemented by two patch sets that need to go in simultaneously.
So one of the ways that that was dealt with in SIBA is that because we have the aggregation point, that's the Helm charts, you might implement your change in one of the repos, create a version that doesn't get used until the Helm charts are updated, but works maybe with another patch set. So then you might release, like to use Volt as an example, you might release an adapter that has a new feature that requires a new version of the core. That gets released, but the Helm chart's not updated to use the new version of the adapter until the core also has the corresponding patch set. Does that make sense from an integration perspective?
It makes sense. I don't see, if you do need changes into repos, I don't see what's wrong with needing to merge two patch sets at the same time. So long as in the commit message for the patch set, you actually mention that, hey, this is part of a larger change. Please consider all the patch sets at the same time and merge them all at the same time.
That's generally a problem when it comes to test automation, because if you gate every patch set with the test and two changes are dependent in two different repos, the test will fail on both branches.
Fair point.
But Matteo, isn't that assumes that you have some test that's running with master of everything. If you're deploying Helm charts as is, except for with the one change, then yes, they would fail because you're testing new code with old code that is incompatible. That's one of the reasons why the changes that go into the Helm charts are atomic across the integrations of different artifacts.
If there is a build that runs across multiple repos, it should tolerate being broken sometimes, and sort of be like, okay, if I'm trying to build faster, like we just need to have the mentality that, well, of course the build's going to break, the change isn't in yet, and we'll merge everything, and if the build still fails, okay, that's something to be fixed, but it's not a reason to not merge the branch. Like it's a different kind of build and test.
I'm sorry, but I completely disagree. I think that having a build that we can accept to be broken is a great way to have a useless build, because the next moment we need to merge a patch because we are in a hurry for a demo or a deliverable, and the build is broken, and we'll fix it later, and 3 days after we don't have a build anymore. So I don't think we should never skip the automated build or the automated result of the test. If there are cases in which our test cannot pass because of action, we need to address that case, but not say, oh, the build can be broken sometime.
I guess all I'm saying is that when you're working across multiple repos, if you're trying to test across multiple repos, you're going to run into this kind of problem no matter what. There isn't really a way around it. And so it's not a good reason to not put features into patch sets. That's all I'm trying to say.
So basically, if I have a patch set or a change that is across repos, the minute I commit one of those changes to one of the repos, the automated build will break because it's reliant on another change that hasn't yet been merged.
I think we're tripping over language here. So let's say you have two components, a core and an adapter, and the adapter to implement a feature needs a new feature in the core. So, and then you have Helm charts that are setting the version. Let's say everything's at 1.0. So what would happen would be the feature might be implemented in the core and in the adapter at the same time. You might increment the core version, and if that core version is still backwards compatible and you're not actually exercising the feature,
yes,
you might update. You might update that. Yeah.
There was a very important statement there. If it's backward compatible,
Right.
right? If you can do this in a sequential way, i.e. update core, then update adapter, and updating the core doesn't break existing adapters, you're absolutely right. That's not the problem. The question is, if the change to the core is not backward compatible, then you can't commit the core.
Right. So maybe this is the distinction. If you're testing the aggregation, if you're testing against the Helm charts, you might take the core from 1.0 to 1.1 and the adapter from 1.0 to 1.1, and then release individual versions. And those versions used with any other version of those containers might break. It might just not work. But then atomically, you update the Helm chart to increment both of those charts to the next version at the same time. That results in you have a jump from working to working, even if individual components combined together would not result in a non-working combination. Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. The problem is if I make a core change, there are unit tests that run. If those unit tests depend on the adapter to have the same change, then the minute I commit the core, that unit test or those sanity tests are going to stop, are going to break.
But
If-
so sanity tests, those sanity tests should be specific to the core. Like at that level, you're not doing multi-repo testing. You should just be doing sanity testing of, okay, does this make sense with the rest of the core? Does it break the core? The adapter is not involved at that point.
I think that's exactly right. That it depends your scope of tests. If your scope for an individual repo is that repo, then it shouldn't rely on a whole lot of external.
So when are we, if the sanity test is single scoped to the repo, when are the tests cross repo being run? So that I know a change to core didn't break my cross repo integrations, if you will.
So I think there's two times when that happens. One is when you bump the versions. So when you bump the Helm chart versions and you bump the versions in the repos. So sorry, bump the versions in the repos first, then bump the versions in the Helm chart and the Helm chart version. I think that's one time, and that should always work. That should always be a working build. I think the other time is one that basically says, okay, ignore all the versions, just try to build all of the masters so that we can know if they work together. And this is the build I'm saying should be able to break sometimes, right? This one's more of just a informative build. Does the latest work right now?
So essentially a canary test. Hey, I'm going to throw the master at everything and see what happens.
Yep.
And I agree that that's valuable, especially as you're nearing a release. It's nice to know that everything would work if you combined all the master versions. It may not be useful in other cases, but it is useful in that case.
So are we going to have a rule on how often these Helm charts are updated? I feel one of the issues we had just from the process in SIBA is that many of us just worked in master and updating Helm chart versions got pushed off, until some important point like nearing a release. And then you kind of have a rush to test the Helm charts at that point. It sounds like we are advocating every time you update a component and your feature is complete, cross components, that you do go in and update the Helm charts and get it integration tested with this Helm chart integration test.
So I'd say that is the case, but just keep in mind that we're also talking about making changes more complete. So you won't just be pushing minor changes all the time. This is only when you have a set of changes complete across multiple repos, or if it isn't just one repo, then obviously it's just not one
But in theory, anytime a commit is made to any of the repos, you also want to start, and a new tag is created, You also want to tick the Helm chart.
And that does mean that there are more changes that get made, one to the code repo or the component repo, and then one to the Helm chart. And
Can we automate that?
That currently, we've looked at trying to do that, and it's somewhat a manual process. One of the other options is to put the Helm charts for a component in the component repo, and then have it tick automatically there, and then have some other integration that happens of the component Helm charts. But we haven't moved in that direction yet, and that actually has some downsides from releasing the whole platform and as an aggregation. It really there's no holy grail here. You're going to end up having a downside in terms of making changes in multiple places in any case.
So David,
Okay. Yes.
there's a timeout. You heard multiple opinions from multiple people. Sometimes the opinions they differ. So at that point, I think we do need to make forward progress. So, as brigade lead, I'm asking you to take a call.
Actually, I thought I heard a lot of consensus, to be honest.
Okay, that's even better.
I actually heard that and I did put some items in the notes, which I call decisions, which might mean a new action there. But basically, I think what we're hearing is taking a lot from what Zach's document here. We do need to clarify some things. I gave Zach an action item about update the document to include a cross repo patch set. I think what we're talking about is doing a single patch set for an entire feature, and that one is, if anything, there might be some comments around that. And as we tick up versions, or as we commit a patch set to the master or to the release, it needs to be backported or forward ported, and that's almost user preference. Zach recommended master to the older branch, but if it doesn't work that way, the other way works as well. As you had pointed out, it goes both ways in Onos. The sanity tests are single repo focused. The cross repo tests are managed through the Helm chart versions. We have to be careful about updating the versions of the Helm charts. There was some talk about viability of a head test, which is the latest of everything that may fail. So I think it's actually coalescing. I'll take an action item to write up, or at least clarify in the notes, the decisions I think we're moving forward with. And we'll go from there. We are at the hour. We didn't quite finish everything. Any other final thoughts before we all jump on to the Volta call?
Just one quick comment, like no matter how we look at branches here and there, bottom line is anytime a feature is submitted, we need to have end-to-end testing submitted as well.
Yes.
Without it, it's we're going nowhere.
Yes, I agree.
Agreed. Thanks, David.
Yep. I will get the notes out. Thank you all for attending, and see you on the next call.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.